It was the sound of the bells that woke me, though I had not been sleeping. St. Aldate's, perhaps, or one of the smaller chapels that scatter their voices like reminders of some older grief. The hour was indistinct. The light that leaked through my curtains was neither dawn nor memory. Oxford has a way of suspending time, as if the city itself refuses to acknowledge the banal progress of hours. I had left the wireless on through the night, more out of habit than comfort. Somewhere between the static and the soft murmur of early news, the name of a college caught my attention. Lonsdale, a death in one of the senior rooms. No further detail given, only that police were investigating. I remember sitting there, the glass of whiskey still half full from the evening before, and feeling that old, unwelcome tremor of curiosity, that peculiar blend of pity and excitement one learns to disguise even from oneself. When I reached Lonsdale an hour later, the city had barely begun to stir. Mist curled over the cobbles, blurring the bicycles and the silhouettes of students hurrying toward nowhere in particular. The porter on duty, a man with the face of someone who had carried too many keys for too long, nodded without warmth when I mentioned my name. He led me silently across the quad, past windows that still held the pale residue of last night's reading lamps. The room in question belonged to Dr. Leonard Vail, a fellow in classics, or so the brass plate announced. It smelled of old paper, pipe smoke, and something fainter like the residue of despair. Vail lay beside his desk, his spectacles crooked beneath him, his hand still touching the edge of a letter half slurred beneath a pile of corrected essays. Heart failure, they said later, though the expression on his face suggested he had seen something he did not entirely believe. Strange, the details one notices. The ink bottle uncapped. The metronome was ticking softly on the mantel, though there was no piano in sight, and a pair of muddy shoes near the fireplace far too large to have been his. I found myself asking the porter whether anyone had visited Dr. Vail during the night. He hesitated, then murmured that he'd heard the bells around midnight and thought nothing of it. It was then I recalled the crossword puzzle folded neatly beside the letter. I cannot resist them, even in death. Vail had filled most of it, save for one clue in the centre where truth hides in plain sight. 5, the intersecting letters suggested cloak, but somehow the word felt wrong, too deliberate, too showy for a man like Vail. I circled it absently, my pencil hovering like a confession unspoken. Lewis arrived some time after 8, carrying that practical sympathy of his that always seemed to belong to another, better world. He spoke of routine, procedure, cause of death, while I stared at the cold hearth and thought of the bells again. Morning bells, calling the faithful to something I could no longer name. When the body was taken away, I lingered. The letter Vail had been writing was addressed to the master. Only a few lines were visible. There are matters of conscience which I can no longer conceal. Then the ink trails off, interrupted by whatever seized his heart or stopped it. I asked Lewis to have it examined for fingerprints, though even as I spoke I knew how absurd that sounded. The dead do not leave us answers, only patterns. Outside, the first sunlight began to press through the mist, catching the spires in that melancholy gold that makes Oxford seem both eternal and exhausted. A student bicycled past, humming a hymn I half recognized from childhood. I stood there for a long while, feeling the weight of the morning settle upon my shoulders like a coat I had once worn too often. Somewhere behind me the chapel bells began again, steady, unyielding, indifferent. And though I could not yet say why, I knew they were ringing not just for Dr. Vail. They were ringing for something else entirely, something that had begun long before the night he died. That was how it started the bells of morning, the whisper of conscience, and a puzzle that refused to stay on paper. It rained the morning they buried Dr. Vale. Not the theatrical kind of rain that demands umbrellas and sympathy, but the quieter, steadier sort that seems to soak directly into one's thoughts. The service was brief, as such things tend to be when the deceased has lived a life among academics rather than friends. The chaplain spoke in a voice as colourless as the sky, and even the earth appeared reluctant to receive him. I stood a little apart, under the shade of an old yew. Lewis was beside me, his collar up, his expression unreadable. He never liked funerals. Few of us do, but for him the discomfort was practical rather than philosophical. I, on the other hand, have always found something curiously compelling about them. The hush, the faint defiance of mortality in the simple act of standing there, breathing while someone else cannot. Across the small crowd I saw a woman in a navy coat, her face half concealed beneath a hat that seemed too elegant for the occasion. She did not lower her head when the prayers began. Her gaze was fixed not on the coffin but on the spire of the chapel, as if she were measuring its height against something invisible. Later, when the mourners began to drift toward the cloisters, she remained still, and I knew then that she was not merely grieving. She was remembering. Lewis murmured that she was a lecturer in English, Dr. Julia Forrester. Vale had been her tutor years ago. There were rumours, he said, of the kind that travels more quickly than truth in academic air. I told him that in Oxford, rumour was truth's most faithful servant. He gave me that look of patient disapproval he keeps for moments when I grow too lyrical. After the burial, the porters led us into the chapel hall, where coffee steamed faintly beside a row of paper cups. The smell of wet coats and carnations mingled with that faintly sour odour of old stone. I spoke briefly with the master of the college, a man whose every word seemed to apologise for existing. He mentioned Vale's declining health, his late-night habits, his obsession with an old manuscript he'd been cataloguing. He said this as though it were merely a hobby gone too far, but I knew the tone of the unease of someone who suspects that intellectual curiosity can turn into something darker. Julia Forrester approached me then. She said she'd heard I was looking into Dr. Vale's death, though it wasn't clear whether she hoped I was or feared it. Her voice carried that quiet Oxford precision that conceals more than it reveals. I told her it was routine, that every sudden death deserved a second glance. She smiled at that, or perhaps it was only the faint tremor of someone remembering how to smile. There was a moment, as she turned to leave, when a small notebook slipped from her hand. I bent to retrieve it, and for a fraction of a second saw what she had been sketching inside the outline of a bell tower, the words, "Where truth hides in plain sight," written neatly beneath. It was the same crossword clue Vale had left unfinished. I said nothing, only handed it back, though something in her eyes suggested she had seen my recognition. When the crowd began to thin, I stepped outside. The rain had eased, leaving the stones slick and shining like the backs of fish. Somewhere in the distance, the bells tolled again, softer now, as if out of courtesy to the dead. I walked slowly along the narrow path between graves, the names on the stones half effaced by moss, each one a small act of erasure. Lewis caught up to me, holding his notebook over his head. He asked what I made of it all. I told him I wasn't sure, though I was lying. Something about the unfinished letter, the ink left open, the clue repeated by another hand. These were not coincidences. They were the faint outline of a pattern still obscured by rain. As we reached the gate, Julia Forrester passed behind us, her umbrella tilting just enough to hide her face. I watched her disappear into the mist, her footsteps soft against the wet gravel. There are moments, I've found, when a case begins not with a fact, but with a feeling of the quiet recognition that the living are keeping secrets from the dead, or perhaps the other way around. That morning in the rain, I felt it keenly. The funeral had ended, but the bells had not. Something within them was still ringing, waiting to be heard. There are few rooms in Oxford that do not carry the smell of something gone. Old paper, old incense, the residue of too many prayers said too late. The chaplain's study at Lonsdale was no exception. When I entered, the air seemed dense with the perfume of dust and a faint sweetness of candle wax. Outside, the drizzle still lingered, the windows greyed by the breath of it. The chaplain himself, Reverend Haldane, sat behind a desk that had once belonged to some greater believer. He looked up with that worn patience I've come to associate with men of faith who have seen too much doubt. He asked if I might be seeking absolution or information. I told him the latter would suffice. He smiled thinly, as though the two were interchangeable. Vale had been a regular visitor, he said. Always troubled, though by what precisely he could not say. He had confessed, not in the ecclesiastical sense, but in the weary tone of a man attempting to untangle the soul by means of conversation. I asked when they had last spoken. A few nights before his death, Haldane said. Vale had come after Compline, stayed nearly an hour. He had spoken of conscience, of betrayal, of something he had discovered but could not reconcile with his loyalty to the college. The chaplain hesitated, his eyes straying to the corner of the room where a Bible lay half open on a lectern. He would not say more, and I did not press. There is a point beyond which questions become cruel. Still I noticed the faint outline of a diary beneath a stack of hymn sheets, the kind issued to every chaplain for recording confessions and pastoral visits. When I asked about it, he said it contained nothing of use, but his fingers tightened on the arm of his chair. That small, involuntary gesture told me enough. I left him with a few polite words, but my mind lingered on that diary long after I stepped into the quad. It was nearly evening now, the rain subsiding into a fine mist that carried the scent of wet leaves. Lonsdale looked different at dusk, softer, more secretive, as if the stone itself were listening. I waited until Haldane's light went out, then returned to the chapel. It was not pride but curiosity that guided me, or perhaps the unholy combination of both. The door yielded to a gentle push, the kind that suggests it is often left unlocked for lost souls. The study was dark, except for the faint glow from a candle guttering in its glass. The diary was where I had last seen it. I told myself I was not stealing, merely borrowing the truth. Its pages were neat, careful, each entry dated and numbered. Most were trivial visits to students in distress, notes on sermons, requests for prayers. But near the end, in the entry marked 2 days before Vale's death, I found what I was looking for, or perhaps what I was not meant to find. Leonard V. came after Compline. Disturbed. Spoke of a letter he had found in the archives concerning the foundation of Lonsdale, a deception involving the master's predecessor. Mentioned the word atonement, requested guidance. I advised him to rest. There was no further entry. The next page was blank, though a faint indentation remained the pressure of words written and then removed. Someone had torn it out carefully, leaving only the ghost of its existence. I held the diary against the candlelight, and for a moment I thought I could make out the shadow of a phrase, something beginning with Julia. I closed the book. My heart was not racing. I've long since lost that luxury. But there was that familiar stirring, the slow awakening of a pattern forming behind the fog. Vale had found something that touched both conscience and history. He had confided in a man bound by silence, and someone had seen fit to erase the trace of his last words. Outside, the rain had begun again, fine as breath on glass. I left the diary where it was, though I carried its absence with me. The chapel bells struck 9, each toll echoing like a question too large to answer. I paused in the courtyard, listening. There are times when Oxford feels like a cathedral of secrets, each corridor a confessional, each whisper a sin waiting to be named. And as I stood beneath that soft, persistent rain, I could almost hear Vale's voice again, murmuring from some unseen corner of the past, where truth hides in plain sight. There are evenings when Oxford feels almost too still, as though the city itself is holding its breath between hymns. That was how it seemed the night I visited the chapel again, summoned not by faith, but by the faint thread of unease that had begun to draw itself around Dr. Vale's death. The choir was rehearsing for evensong, their voices rising and falling with a precision that felt both human and divine. Beneath it all, I could hear the faint shuffle of shoes, the rustle of robes, small earthly sounds beneath the architecture of devotion. I sat near the back, unseen, watching the choirmaster's hands conduct something more than music. A boy in the front row, pale, faltered on a note. The choirmaster stopped, corrected him with a smile that did not reach his eyes, and the singing began again, smoother, emptier. It occurred to me that perfection, like guilt, often sounds rehearsed. When the rehearsal ended, I walked outside into the courtyard, where the scent of wet stone met the faint sweetness of candle smoke. A woman was waiting there, her figure framed by the glow from the chapel doorway. She introduced herself as Mrs. Vale Eleanor. Widowhood did not seem to fit her, yet it clung awkwardly, like a borrowed coat. She said she had been told I was investigating her husband's death, though she doubted there was much to discover. Leonard, she said, had always been drawn to complications, both intellectual and personal. Her voice was low, deliberate. The kind of voice that conceals more than it reveals. I asked if her husband had enemies. She smiled at that, a small, sad smile that told me the question was both naive and necessary. In Oxford, she said, the word enemy is rather crude. One collects rivals instead cultivated, courteous, and no less lethal. We walked beneath the cloisters, the rain whispering against the arches. She spoke of the manuscript he had been cataloguing, an obscure medieval text concerning the college's foundation. He had become obsessed, convinced it contained evidence of forgery in the original endowment. She had tried to dissuade him. There are some truths, she said, that cannot survive daylight. I asked whether she knew of Dr. Julia Forrester. The pause that followed was not long, but it was deep. Of course, she said at last. Leonard admired her mind. It was the sort of admiration that requires explanation, but none was offered. I thought of the notebook, the sketch of the bell tower, the repeated clue about truth hiding in plain sight. There was a pattern beginning to take shape faintly, like music heard through a closed door. Before she left, Mrs. Vale asked whether I believed her husband had taken his own life. I told her the truth, that I did not know. She looked at me with a kind of weary clarity and said that Leonard had always been more afraid of silence than of sin. Then she turned toward the gate, her umbrella opening like a small act of defense against the world. I remained for a while, listening to the last echoes of the choir's rehearsal drifting through the open windows. The melody was unfamiliar, yet something in its phrasing reminded me of a line from the Diary Atonement. I could not help noticing that the word, when broken, becomes at one moment unity, reconciliation. Perhaps that was what Vale had sought, and what he had never found. As I walked back across the quad, I caught sight of the choir boy again, the same one who had faltered earlier. He was standing alone by the notice board, reading something pinned there, a list of names, perhaps. When he saw me, he startled, then hurried away toward the gate. On the ground where he had stood, I noticed a single sheet of paper, damp from the rain. It was a music score, annotated in Vale's handwriting. In the margin, beside the final line of the hymn, he had written 3 words: "Truth demands harmony." It might have meant nothing, or it might have been his last note to the world. I pocketed the paper and stood for a moment under the dripping eaves, watching the chapel lights fade to gold. The city was quiet again, wrapped in that strange stillness that comes after revelation, but before understanding. Somewhere in the dark, the bells stirred faintly, hesitant, as if they too were listening for something unfinished. There are places in Oxford where the air itself seems to remember. Lonsdale after nightfall was one of them, a labyrinth of cloisters and stairwells where every echo carried the weight of older sins. I returned there on an evening when the city's lamps were half veiled by fog and the cobbles shone like dark mirrors. I had no particular reason to go back, except that something within me resisted the idea of leaving things unfinished. It was not justice I sought, nor even truth, but the faint alignment of thought that occurs when a pattern begins to fit. The porter was dozing in his chair when I entered, his newspaper folded neatly across his chest. He started when I asked about Dr. Vale's rooms. No one had been allowed in since the investigation, he said. Regulations, he added with that small pride peculiar to men whose lives depend on boundaries. I told him regulations were only useful until they weren't. He looked uncertain, but keys have a way of yielding to insistence, and soon I found myself climbing the narrow staircase to the upper corridor, where the lamps burned low and the walls smelled faintly of damp wool and chalk. Vale's door creaked open with the reluctance of a confession. The air inside had not changed that same stale mixture of paper, pipe smoke, and loneliness. Dust had begun to settle over the books, over the half-drunk cup of tea left to fossilize beside a stack of essays. There was an intimacy in the disarray, the kind that belongs to someone who has left without intending to. I sat at his desk, studying the objects that remained. A photograph of Eleanor Vale, the widow, taken perhaps 10 years earlier, a slip of parchment with Latin notations, and a college calendar pinned to the wall. My eyes caught on a small mark, a faint circle drawn around a date 3 days before his death. Evensong, no other annotation. But beside it, in the margin, Vale had written a single word, choir. It should have meant nothing, another rehearsal, another evening lost to routine. Yet, remembering the choir boy who had dropped the sheet of music, I felt a small spark of recognition. The note Vale had written on that sheet, "Truth demands harmony," was not merely philosophical, it was literal. A clue hidden in plain sight, sung perhaps by those who never knew what they carried. I turned the parchment over, scanning the underside of the Latin text. The handwriting was Vale's, but something about the phrasing struck me as deliberate, almost encoded. It referred to a foundation built on confession and a sin made stone. I wondered whether he meant the college itself. It would not be the first time that Oxford's beauty had been constructed upon something best forgotten. From the corridor, I heard footsteps, not hurried but steady, deliberate, the kind that signals purpose rather than chance. I closed the parchment and waited. The door opened slightly and Julia Forrester stood there, her face pale in the lamplight. She said she thought she might find me here. I asked how she knew, because, she said, "You're the only person who still listens when the dead speak." She came closer, her hands clasped around a small envelope. Inside was a letter, Vale's handwriting again. She said it had slipped under her door 2 nights before he died. She had not shown it to anyone. It contained only one line. "The master is not what he seems, no signature, only his initials." I asked why she hadn't mentioned it earlier. She said she didn't trust the college, nor herself. Her voice trembled, though not with fear, more like the exhaustion of someone who has carried too much silence. I noticed then a faint smudge of ink on her sleeve, fresh, as if she'd been writing only moments ago. When she left, I remained in the half-dark, the letter in my hand, the room pressing close around me. The silence of it was almost sentient. Outside, the fog thickened, dimming the lanterns along the quad until only their halos remained. I thought again of Vale's crossword clue, where truth hides in plain sight. Perhaps it was not a riddle, but an instruction. In a city built on learning, concealment is the oldest craft of all. I replaced the letter where it belonged and left the room as I had found it, untouched, unresolved, waiting. Behind me, the corridor seemed longer than before, stretching into shadow. And somewhere in the distance, faint but certain, the chapel bell began to toll, one, then another, then silence. The tape arrived without explanation, in a brown envelope that smelled faintly of mildew and dust. There was no note, no return address, only my name typed neatly across the front, the kind of typeface used by people who still fear handwriting. I found it on my desk one morning, wedged between case reports and a half-finished crossword. For a moment, I thought it might have been a mistake, some misdelivered archive from a forgotten file. But something about its weight, the quiet insistence of its presence, told me it was not. Lewis was there when I first played it. He leaned against the window, half listening, half wondering whether I was indulging another of my curiosities. The tape hissed before the voice began, a man's, low, deliberate, as if speaking to himself. It was Vale. Even through the distortion, the tone was unmistakable scholarly precision, frayed by something close to fear. He began not with apology, but with analysis. He spoke of truth as a construct, of guilt as a form of order. Then, after a pause, came the words that pulled the room tighter around us. "I am complicit," he said. "I have seen the document. The master knows. Julia knows." There was a faint scrape, perhaps a chair shifting, perhaps a breath caught too late. Then the sound of a clock, chiming. 4 notes, clear and deliberate. Lewis asked whether it might be a fake. I said perhaps, but the human voice, when near breaking, contains something that cannot be forged, that strange tremor of intellect colliding with conscience. I listened again, and this time noticed a faint rhythm beneath the words, a soft, irregular tapping, like fingers against wood. 4 taps, a pause, 3 more. Morse code, I thought, though the irony did not escape me. Later, when I checked, the pattern translated to one word, help. We played the tape twice more. Each time the same detail seemed to shift the chime, the echo, the way the sentence trailed off into silence. The distortion was not random, it was deliberate. Someone had tampered with it. Lewis suggested we send it for analysis, but I preferred to keep it close. Evidence loses its truth once passed through too many hands. That evening I returned to Lonsdale. The porter was less cordial this time, his curiosity sharpened by rumour. I asked whether any of the chapel clocks had recently been serviced. He frowned, then said the small one in the choir loft had stopped the week before Vale's death stuck, he said, at 4. 4 chimes, 4 taps. I climbed to the loft alone. The air smelled of dust and candle smoke and the faint chill of neglected places. The old tape recorder sat on the lectern, wires trailing like veins across the floor. I pressed play. Nothing but static, then faintly, the same 4 notes. I imagined Vale sitting there after hours, recording his thoughts under the guise of rehearsal, knowing perhaps that someone was listening even then. Beneath the recorder lay a single reel of unused tape, labelled simply Confession 2. The second half of something unfinished. I left it untouched. Curiosity is one thing, desecration another. Yet as I stood there, I could not shake the feeling that the tape had not been meant for me at all, but for whoever would come next. Oxford breeds that kind of foresight, secrets buried with the expectation of discovery. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft against the stained glass. I thought of Eleanor Vale, her measured grief of Julia Forrester, her quiet intelligence tinged with guilt. The word complicit returned, heavy, unsatisfied. Perhaps they all were not in murder, but in silence. Later that night, alone in my flat, I poured a whiskey and replayed the tape once more. The hiss filled the room like breath. The voice emerged, distant now, almost pleading. "If you find this," it said, "forgive me." Then the chime again, the last note lingering longer than before, as if waiting for an answer. I sat there, long after it ended, listening to the quiet between the sounds. The tape had not revealed the truth, it had only confirmed its shape, indistinct, half-heard, human. Somewhere between the static and the silence, Vale had left a message, not for the living, but for those willing to listen. And though I would never admit it to Lewis, I found myself listening still, long after the tape had stopped. Dr. Lang was one of those men who seemed to have aged out of sentiment. He had the kind of face that gave nothing away, the calm geometry of intellect, untroubled by the softening touch of empathy. When I met him in his office at Lonsdale, the room smelled faintly of disinfectant and chalk dust, an odd combination for a man who lectured on physiology. He motioned me to sit but did not rise, and I remember thinking that even his politeness was clinical, performed out of respect for structure rather than person. He said he had known Vale for 20 years. They had collaborated once, long ago, on a paper about moral philosophy and neural response, an experiment, he added, that had produced more discomfort than discovery. Since then, they had occupied parallel orbits, intersecting only when departmental politics demanded it. He called Vale brilliant but erratic, a man given to obsession. He spoke the word as if diagnosing a condition. When I asked whether he had seen Vale in the days before his death, Lang's fingers drummed lightly on the desk. Once, briefly. Vale came to him with some absurd idea about the college's original benefactors being fictitious. He had found a document, apparently forged, and thought it proved something dreadful. Lang said he had advised him to leave it alone, so that such things were better left to historians and ghosts. He said it with a small smile that did not belong to the sentence. Lewis, who stood by the window pretending not to listen, later described Lang as the kind of man who'd pick up a snake just to see how it moved. I thought that wasn't far from the truth. His curiosity was sharp enough to wound, and though he denied knowing anything of Vale's so-called confession, I caught a flicker in his expression when I mentioned the tape. Not fear, calculation. On his desk was a crossword half completed. I asked whether he had a fondness for them. He said he found them relaxing. I looked at the clues, instrument of deceit 7, to which he had written disguise, another, truth's disguise, one might say, 5, that space remained blank. I told him the answer might be guise again. He frowned, said repetition was inelegant, but I reminded him that truth often hides in plain sight. He looked at me then with a faint amusement that seemed to register more than my words. When I left, Lewis remarked that I had gone easy on him. I told him I preferred to listen first. Lang was not the kind of man who lied outright, he omitted, which was far more revealing. I thought of his drumming fingers, the suppressed smile, the crossword left intentionally unfinished. Later that evening, I visited the archives where Vale had supposedly discovered the forged document. The librarian, a nervous woman with the eyes of someone always being overheard, said Vale had requested a specific set of papers relating to the college's founding bequests. She remembered because Dr. Lang had signed for them earlier that same week. I asked whether the two men had been together. She said no, Vale had come the day after Lang returned them. She added in a whisper that carried a kind of reverence that one page had gone missing from the file. I walked back across the quad, the air cool and heavy with the scent of rain. The chapel bell struck 7, its echo folding into the narrow lanes beyond the gate. Somewhere, a student laughed at a sound that felt indecent in its simplicity. I paused beneath one of the lamps, the yellow light soft against the stone, and thought of that missing page, the one neither man had acknowledged. Back at my flat, I poured a measure of whiskey and opened my notebook. On the margin beside Vale's name, I wrote 2 words, Lang caretaker, not of Vale's memory but of his undoing. The red herring was not the man himself, but the precision with which he had arranged to seem irrelevant. He had handed me a lie polished into truth, and I had almost thanked him for it. Still there was something unsatisfying about the neatness of it, too constructed, too easily dismissed. A proper red herring never swims alone. It leaves behind a scent strong enough to mask what truly matters. Before turning in, I looked again at the crossword he had left on his desk, the one with the word guys unsolved. It occurred to me then that repetition was precisely the point. When a word appears twice, it is not an error, but an emphasis. Vale had written it once. Lang had refused to write it again. I stared at the page until the whiskey was gone, until the letters blurred. Somewhere in the dark of that thought, the answer shifted. Truth's disguise, one might say, not guise, but ghost. It arrived, as most significant things do, without fanfare, slipped quietly into my hand by the porter at Lonsdale, who claimed not to know from whom it came. A plain envelope, no name, no seal. Inside, a photograph, black and white, slightly creased, smelling faintly of tobacco and old varnish. 5 figures stood in front of the college chapel Vale, the master, Julia Forrester, Dr. Lang, and the chaplain, Reverend Haldane. The image was dated only by the shadows it caught, long and uncertain, suggesting early evening in late autumn. At first there was nothing unusual about it. Academics frozen mid-gesture, as if caught between formality and fatigue. Yet, as I studied it under the lamp, one detail drew me in Vale's hand. Resting lightly on the master's shoulder, though the expression on his face suggested distance, not camaraderie. His eyes, even blurred by age, seemed to be looking elsewhere, beyond the frame. There was something almost pleading in the angle of his mouth, a tension that no photographer could have intended. Lewis thought I was overreading it. A group photo, he said, nothing more. But there's a kind of confession that lives inside photographs of the unspoken pattern of where people choose to stand. Julia's position was interesting, slightly apart, near the edge, as though she had been reluctant to join. Lang stood behind her, not beside, his gaze fixed on something out of view, and the chaplain's eyes closed, mid-blink perhaps, or in prayer. Only the master looked squarely at the lens, his smile precise, immaculate, professional. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, was a single phrase, harmony before dissonance. I'd seen those words before. Vale's hand, scribbled in the margin of a music sheet, the same day we found him. Later that evening, I visited the archives again. The librarian was gone. Only the hum of the heating pipes kept company with the smell of old paper. I laid the photograph on the table beneath the brass reading lamp and began searching through the college record books, tracing names and dates like a man deciphering a psalm. The college had celebrated its centenary 5 years earlier, an event attended, according to the ledger, by all 5 people in the photograph. The image must have been taken that evening. A glass ring had stained the edge of one of the record pages. Next to it, in the master's neat, deliberate handwriting, a note: Foundation grant confirmed. Provenance undisputed. It struck me as a curious choice of words: undisputed, not authentic. That was the language of reassurance, not certainty. I remembered what Vale had said in his taped confession, "The master knows." Perhaps this photograph had been less a keepsake than a record of complicity. When I returned home, I propped the photograph on the mantel beside my whiskey glass. The faces watched me as I thought. Julia's glance, the master's smile, the chaplain's closed eyes, each a small act of omission. I found myself recalling the bells of Lonsdale that morning after Vale's death, the precise pattern of their chimes, harmony before dissonance, order before confession. The phrase was both musical and moral, a declaration of sequence. Something had been agreed upon or rehearsed. I took out the crossword Vale had left unfinished. The clue that had haunted me still remained. Where truth hides in plain sight. 5. I had circled the cloak once, discarded it later, but now, looking at the photograph again, I wondered, if truth hides in plain sight, perhaps it is not beneath something, perhaps it is the thing itself. The answer revealed itself slowly, almost a shy image. I wrote it down and for a brief moment felt the alignment that comes when thought meets instinct. Then it passed, leaving only unease. If the image was the truth, what truth did this one show? I studied it once more, holding it closer to the light. That was when I noticed the faintest reflection in the chapel's stained glass window behind them, a blurred figure, distant, watching from within. The angle was wrong for the photographer. Someone else had been present, someone unacknowledged. I don't know why that detail unsettled me as much as it did. Perhaps because it confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect, that every story in Oxford has an observer who never appears in the frame. The photograph still sits on my desk between my notebook and the empty glass. I've looked at it often since, though I'm no closer to knowing whether it captured a truth or merely preserved a lie. But sometimes, in the stillness before dawn, when the city begins to stir, and the bells of Lonsdale call out their measured sorrow, I imagine Vale standing once more before that chapel, aware that he too had finally stepped out of harmony. It was a small mistake, barely audible, yet it changed everything. I might never have noticed it had I not been sitting in the chapel that evening, listening more out of habit than faith. The choir had gathered to rehearse an old one, plaintive, the kind that rises and falls like a sigh. I had come to think better in music than in silence. The conductor, that same choirmaster with the smile too careful for comfort, raised his hand, and the first note filled the air like a breath released. Halfway through the verse, I heard it, a single, misplaced note. The boy who had faltered before the one I had seen by the notice board had sung a line 1 bar ahead of the rest. He caught himself, corrected it almost instantly, and the others continued as though nothing had happened. But I recognized the pattern. 4 notes, a pause, 3 more, the same rhythm as Vale's tapping on the confession tape. I had dismissed it then as a nervous habit. Now it returned like an echo, too deliberate to ignore. After the rehearsal, I waited in the shadows near the archway. The boy emerged last, clutching his sheet music to his chest. His name was Simon. I asked if he knew Dr. Vale. He hesitated, then said he'd once helped the old man with recordings for the college archive, reading aloud from documents in Latin. His voice, Vale said, carried the right purity of tone. He seemed uneasy, as if afraid of being overheard. I asked if he remembered anything unusual. He nodded and said Vale always made him sing a line from the hymn they'd rehearsed tonight. Always the same verse, never the others. I asked which verse. He recited it softly, almost reverently. The truth shall sound, though hearts grow dim. That was when the bell began to toll outside, and the boy flinched. He excused himself and left hurriedly through the cloister. I stood there a moment longer, the words circling in my mind. The truth shall sound, though hearts grow dim. Not a hymn, but a message. Later in my flat I found Vale's tape again and played it slowly, marking the pauses. The rhythm 4 then 3 wasn't random. It matched the meter of that very line. When I reversed the segment between the chimes, the distortion seemed almost to form syllables, not coherent words, but fragments of melody, as though Vale had hidden meaning within sound. He was speaking through music, not language. Harmony before dissonance, truth before silence. The next morning I visited Julia Forrester. Her rooms looked different in daylight shelves, heavy with books, a typewriter resting like a relic on her desk. I told her about the hymn, about the boy. She said she remembered Vale's fondness for it, though she thought it childish, the kind of sentimental ritual that made him feel closer to his students. Then she stopped. Her eyes moved toward the piano near the window, its lid half open. There, on the stand, was the same sheet of music, annotated in Vale's handwriting. But beneath the final line he had written something else, Psalm 5:18. I looked it up later. Make me hear joy and gladness, that the bones which thou hast broken may rejoice. Confession again, not of crime, but of conscience. That evening I returned once more to the chapel. The air was sharp with candle wax and the lingering sweetness of incense. I sat at the organ bench and played the opening bars of the hymn hesitantly. The notes echoed off the stone, brittle, lonely. And then I saw the small brass plate fixed to the instrument's side, donated in memory of Leonard Vale. The date was recent. The master's doing, no doubt. Commemoration is Oxford's neatest form of erasure. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of something behind the organ stool, a small, folded card, dust-covered. Inside, in Vale's hand again, were 2 words. Forgive him. No name, no context, only the weight of it. Outside, the sky had begun to darken. The bells started once more precise, unwavering. Each chime seemed to find its echo in me. I walked along the cloister, past the choir room, past the door to Lang's office. A faint strain of music drifted through the wall, the same hymn played softly, almost tenderly, and for a moment I could not tell whether it was grief or understanding that settled over me, perhaps both. The error of the hymn had not been a mistake. It was a message, carried by a boy's trembling voice, repeated until someone chose to listen. But by then, as always in Oxford, it was already too late. The city was still when I woke that peculiar hour before dawn, when Oxford held its breath as though reluctant to commit itself to another day. A thin light had begun to gather at the edges of the curtains, cold and colourless. Somewhere a bell struck 5, Matins. The sound travelled through the streets like a memory too stubborn to fade. I had not slept. The events of the past week had settled over me like sediment, fine and inescapable. Vale's letter, the photograph, the hymn, each had formed part of a pattern, though the meaning remained half submerged, like words beneath water. I poured a whiskey, though the clock insisted it was far too early, and sat by the window watching the mist rise from the river. The world felt suspended, unfinished. It was then I decided to return to Lonsdale one final time, not as an investigator, but as a listener. There are questions that can only be answered in silence. The porter seemed unsurprised to see me, though his eyes carried that look of weary curiosity men develop when tragedy becomes routine. He said the master was in the chapel, attending Matins with the choir. I told him I would join. The service had already begun when I entered. The air was thick with candle wax and incense, the kind that softens stone and thought alike. The choir's voices floated through the gloom, measured, disciplined, reverent. I recognized the melody immediately. Vale's hymn. The one that had threaded itself through every corner of the case, the one that refused to end. The master stood near the front, his posture impeccable, his head bowed in imitation of humility. Julia Forrester was there too, her face turned slightly away, though her expression betrayed a calm that was almost studied. And in the front row the choir boy, Simon, pale, watchful, his lips moving with the effort of memory. I took a seat near the back, unseen. As they sang, my eyes drifted to the brass plate on the organ again, in memory of Leonard Vale. The irony struck me anew. Oxford has a way of sanctifying what it cannot bear to examine. Halfway through the hymn, the boy faltered, his voice caught, wavered, and then deliberately, unmistakably he sang the wrong line. Not error this time, but defiance. The truth shall sound, though hearts grow dim, he sang it twice. The choirmaster hesitated, uncertain whether to stop or continue. The master turned sharply, his face tightening in a flicker of something between anger and fear. The choir stumbled into silence. In that pause, that exquisite, fragile hush, I saw it clearly. The photograph, the hymn, the confession, all pointing to this moment. Vale had not written his message for me. He had written it for them, for those gathered here, beneath these same arches. The truth shall sound. And it did, through a boy's trembling voice, through a misplaced note that could no longer be buried beneath ceremony. When the service ended, the master approached me in the corridor. He asked if I had enjoyed it. His tone was courteous, but the skin around his eyes was tight. I told him the hymn had been illuminating. He said he had hoped it would bring peace. I asked, whose peace? He did not reply, only offered a faint smile, the kind that hides exhaustion rather than goodwill, and walked away. Outside the morning had sharpened. The mist had lifted, leaving the spires etched against a pale sky. Lewis waited by the gate, hands in his pockets, looking as though he had been there for hours. He asked if it was over. I said no, it never really is. We walked toward the high street in silence. The city was waking, bicycles clattering, pigeons scattering across the cobbles, the faint hum of a bus engine somewhere beyond the walls. Ordinary sounds, ordinary life returning to fill the spaces tragedy leaves behind. Yet beneath it all, I could still hear the echo of the hymn, faint but persistent, woven into the air like a promise half kept. That night, back in my flat, I played the tape one last time. The hiss seemed softer now, the voice distant, but no longer desperate. I listened until the end, until the final chime faded. Then I turned it off and sat in the quiet. There was no revelation, no satisfaction, only that peculiar ache that comes when mystery gives way not to truth, but to understanding. And somewhere beyond the window, carried by the wind through the dreaming spires, I heard the bells begin again. Matins, the city's first confession, its first lie. There is a certain kind of light that belongs only to Oxford, a pale, devotional glow that seems to rise from the stone itself, as if the city were built not on earth, but on some quieter substance. That morning it fell across the courtyard at Lonsdale like a benediction, softening the edges of everything it touched. It might have been beautiful had I not known what it was illuminating. The chapel doors were open when I arrived. Inside, the air was cold and dense with the faint smell of wax and damp wool. The candles from Matins still flickered weakly, their wicks whispering in their own small voices. I found myself walking to the lectern without thinking, drawn by something I couldn't quite name. The stained glass above the altar caught my attention not for its beauty, but for what it concealed. I had seen it 100 times before, that depiction of St. Michael weighing the souls of men, his scales tipped eternally toward mercy. But now, in that exact light, something shifted. A reflection, faint but definite, shimmered through the lower pane words, etched not in the glass but behind it. Lewis came in quietly behind me. He asked what I was staring at. I told him I wasn't sure. Together we climbed to the small staircase that led to the organ loft, the air thick with dust and old music. The window from behind was half obscured by timber supports, but near its base, scratched faintly into the lead, were 2 initials. LV beneath them, almost lost to the corrosion of time, were 4 more letters, FIHD. It took me a moment to understand. Forgive him, he did. The same words from the note behind the organ stool, now given permanence in glass and metal. Vale's final act, hidden in the chapel, that had been both his refuge and his undoing. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him it meant the story was over, though I wasn't sure I believed it. He said he'd fetch the master, but I asked him not to. Oxford is full of memorials that tell lies in the name of peace. This one, at least, should be allowed to speak truth quietly. We stood there for a while, watching the sunlight bleed through the coloured panes, catching dust in mid-air. It felt less like revelation and more like surrender. Vale hadn't wanted to expose them, not entirely. He had wanted acknowledgement, a whisper, not a trial. His confession had been neither accusation nor apology, but something stranger, a plea for recognition that wrongdoing had not been without cause. As we left the chapel, I noticed a faint hum, not the choir this time, but the organ itself. One of the keys had been left pressed down, the air leaking through it in a single, steady note. I touched it gently and the sound ceased. Sometimes the smallest noise is the hardest to bear. Outside, the light had grown stronger. The mist that had haunted the quads for days had finally lifted, revealing the city with all its impossible clarity. For a moment I thought I saw Julia Forrester standing by the gate, her coat caught in the wind, a letter in her hand. She saw me too, and there was a kind of recognition there, not of forgiveness, but of understanding. Then she turned and walked away, her figure dissolving into the sunlit distance. I lingered a while longer, listening to the faint clatter of bicycles, the murmured laughter of early students. Oxford had returned to its routines, indifferent to the secrets that had passed through it. The light fell across the stones, revealing nothing and everything at once. That night I returned to my flat and poured one final whiskey. The tape lay on the table, the photograph beside it. I thought of Vale's voice, the tremor in it, the courage it takes to confess not to crime, but to believe that truth, in its rawest form, is too fragile for the world. I didn't play the tape again. Some things, once heard, do not require repetition. Instead, I sat by the window, watching the lamps flicker along the river, and thought of that faint light behind the glass, the one hidden in the stone, steady, patient, eternal. Oxford slept beneath it, as it always had, and I, though no wiser, felt the weight of silence lift just enough to breathe.